Thyself is dedicated to the exploration of the most rewarding task an individual can ever embark on, the journey to find oneself. Our intention is to investigate the universal principles that have equipped our species to seek the treasure of all treasures, self-knowledge. With your hosts, Daniel and Eduardo, this is the Know Thyself podcast. Welcome to the Know Thyself podcast. I'm here with Daniel.
Hello.
And I am Eduardo. And good morning to you, my friend. It's good to see you this morning.
It's good morning to see you, man. I'm very excited to carry on this fun little break of a conversation. That's such a great story that we're going to kind of discuss today.
Yeah, me too, man. I know that we've been talking about this for quite some time. And for the listeners who have been suggesting to do this breakdown of this wonderful story, we thank you. But we've had a few conversations about doing this movie and this story. And what we're referring to is Pinocchio. And if you haven't seen the latest movie, highly recommend it. We will be, kind of cross-referencing the story in general, but also the one that came out from Guillermo del Toro. And there's just so much to unfold. And so rather than just, sticking to, again, one movie or one idea of the movie, we're going to just sort of talk about this as a whole and the overarching theme of what this represents. And before we even started recording, I like that you and I were sort of in agreement of how the whole story itself is one. All characters involved are all of the essence of who we are. And so I think that's kind of like the hat we'll be wearing today and how we'll be breaking this down. But I have a little bit of a background if you want me to go ahead and, start that off. For a lot of people who might have just seen Pinocchio now, right? So, Pinocchio, written in the late 19th century by a man named Carlo Collodi, an Italian writer, and he had a series with Pinocchio, which is still, a boy that was carved by Geppetto in a Tuscan village, and he's a wooden puppet that basically dreams of becoming a real boy. And so that's the story that we've always known, and that's where it stemmed from, but where it really kind of took over a lot of audience members and in the film industry was when it was released in 1940. And unfortunately, I read that, I don't know if it was like Wikipedia, I don't know where I read about this, but it was saying that when the movie was released, it wasn't a big hit because World War II was happening at the time. So they re-released it a couple years after its original release, and then it really hit home. Like it doubled down because people could really relate to it. I don't know if it was that from people coming back from the war was ending at the time, and with so much despair at that time, and the idea of fascism and all of this stuff going on, it just really kind of hit hard. And I think it was like the second largest film, or maybe even larger than Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So anyways, that's a little bit of a background on Pinocchio. And so fast forward to now, I know a lot of people are watching two different versions. There's one that Disney came out with, which I have not seen, and recently, that is. And then there's the one that I really gravitated towards, which is the one by Guillermo del Toro. But again, Daniel and I have talked about Pinocchio several times, with, just different philosophies that apply to the idea of this story. And so we will now do this episode on those conversations we've had in private here with you today. So I'm very excited, man, because I know you and I have not only been wanting to break down a new movie or a new story, but this is one, like I said, that even just as friends, we will just bring up in conversation. So I'm stoked.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I like that you kind of brought up when this movie was released, and you kind of see that pull towards the whole collective community to find archetypal stories, especially after something so collectively traumatic like World War II happened. And I think that that's something that's really interesting that we're going to kind of see in this modern day retelling by Del Toro is the influence of the collective decisions and the trauma that kind of encompasses all of consciousness by this misuse of the shadow that we're going to kind of see the lack of connecting to the childhood essence and making ourselves whole. Well, that creates a projection in the external where we're going to see these traumatic events that are the afflictions of human history. And we're going to kind of see these patterns, and we're going to even watch this build up in the film. And I think that plays such a large role when we really start to understand the beast at the end, which is the whale, and going to the belly of the beast, and how we kind of, transcend that. And I think it's such a unique story. The original writer of this story does have Freemasonic connections, and not saying that as a conspiracy thing, but more for the understanding that if somebody's aware of this esoteric knowledge, they're going to infuse it into their stories, because that's how you tell a good story. It's even interesting, even Del Toro, is, I believe, at least publicly, he claims that he's an atheist. But he obviously studies esoteric, information, because we're not only going to see stuff that was very much location wise to like Italy with these stories, but we're also going to see Eastern influence and even Nordic influence in this. And so he might be an atheist, but if he wants a payday, he knows what makes the money, which is the archetypal stories, the stories of our consciousness, And so, cashing in on that is something that we're going to kind of see. And there's a reason why these directors cash in on these stories, because these are the stories of us. These are the stories of you. And I think Pinocchio does such a great job of telling the the dance with becoming self-reliant, the impact of what the truth means, learning that the things that you think hold you back in life are actually your special gifts, and that you can actually utilize the things that you think ostracize you to actually unify and kind of evolve. And it's the most difficult aspects of ourselves to incorporate that is what the universe needs us to incorporate for this evolution to continue in a healthy, nurturing manner. And so I love where this story begins. I love how this story ends. And so I guess we can kind of just jump right into maybe the characters or how the story starts. How did you want to
Yeah.
approach this? Because you're right, it's such a wide conversation to be able to be kind of had together.
Well, no, as just I just want to say really quick, one of the things you just brought up that I thought was so important, and I think that we're just gonna take it from where you just left off, obviously, but with the idea of not just the shadow self, but mostly losing that childhood essence. And when I can go back just a little bit to Del Toro, because I didn't know he was an atheist, but I did know that he didn't have, he doesn't really disclose his sort of, ideologies and whatnot. But obviously, if you're going to commit so much to this into a film, you're a well-read individual. But one interview I saw with him a while back when he was producing this stop action film, which I honestly took a lot of time and work. What kept him going that he described was his mother. And I think that's interesting that he was so vulnerable to explain that. He said, when I was a kid, this is the story I would go back to over and over and over again with my mother. My mother would read me the story. And he said the year that he started producing the film, his mother, I think, became ill. Don't quote me on that, but I know she passed away right before it was released. And so a lot of his a lot of things that he might have done in the movie he may have not have like incorporated if it wasn't for such a personal involvement with the story itself, which I think is very beautiful. I think it's one thing to take a film that's already been created, a story that's already been laid out, especially by Carlo Collodi, but then for you to kind of like give a little bit more of a spin off from your own interpretations, to just kind of sprinkle a little more in there is sort of a very important thing, that someone with that kind of influence can do. You know what I mean? You can stick to the original, or you can kind of go, you know what, let's push a little further. And so that's something that I like. You know, the opening scene right away, you know, has these. There's something that you said to me a few days ago that I liked. You said there's these, and even this morning you said it, which is he doesn't put this information right there in front of you, but it's just these small little adjustments in the film that you can see that leave big messages. And even the first scene, the camera opens up to, you know, the pine cone. And so we've talked about the pine cone, and a lot of people will break down the idea of the pine cone, but you know, just Pinocchio itself, the word, you know, I know it's been said by a couple other people, so most people already know this by now, but you know, Pinocchio referring to the pineal gland, and Occhio referring to, you know, oculus, the third eye. And so, you know, there's a lot that you can break down from there. You can take that for what it is. You can go down your own rabbit hole of opening that. But in the opening scene, the Geppetto says something that I thought was very profound, and I try to look at this from the eyes of a child. And so after the scene opens up, you see Geppetto and his son, which obviously, you know, as an ode to the writer, the son of Geppetto is named Carlo. But one of the things that I took away from this, and I want to, you know, slow down my roll here and talk about the pine cone, but there's a moment where the boy holding the pine cone is told by Geppetto, when one life is lost, another must grow, you know, and it's kind of a foreshadowing of what will happen eventually to Geppetto's son. You know, the pine cone is planted, and from the tree another life grows, and then we'll have Pinocchio. But again, I just wanted to sort of bring up how these like scenes that are very heavy are so short and so much to the point, but there's so much to take away from that. So I do want to kind of just pause and talk about the pineal gland, talk about the pine cone, talk about the reference for that, because there's so much to that. So go right ahead, my friend. I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, perfect, man. And I think we should like, you know, take this time as it is kind of the introduction of the movie to explore the pine cone and its significance and its connection to the pineal gland. This is going to be symbolism that we're going to find all throughout the study of the esoteric in all cultures, and it's true representation of its internal function inside of the human conscious experience. And it's no coincidence. And I think it kind of comes to my story of when I was like saying that, like, you know, Del Toro is a like self-claimed atheist. I think that's just publicly. I think a lot of people actually hold spiritual beliefs that they kind of keep from the public because it allows for this. I think it's just kind of part of that process. And I think this showing this, you know, as an indicator right in the beginning, really is this representation of the esoteric understanding how the soul and the spirit actually enters form and through the body. It is through the pineal gland. It's actually like the gateway into consciousness. And it's actually what we actually bring up this unique kind of fluid and spiritual experience to get housed in and further connected to what we left, which was that universal consciousness. It is the pineal gland that connects us back to the infinite. And it allows for us to, through the trade of understanding this life, we understand that there was a trade, which was, you know, we traded infinite life and our connection to universal consciousness. We traded it for a sovereign experience as a personal entity within creation. And there's this trade that we have to learn, which is this understanding of the energies that this pineal gland receives and actually how to utilize them to our growth, that allows for us to trade off our isolation and connect us back to that source energy that's ultimately guiding us. And so this pineal gland is the alpha and the omega of the spiritual experience. And it's one of the greatest lessons to learn, not only, you know, its role of bringing life in, but this is actually the alchemical spot that we actually do all the transmuting of as well, and connecting it to these bigger archetypal understandings that are presented through like these stories.
Awesome, man. And I love that we're starting right off with that understanding of the pine cone and the significance of the pineal gland, because there's so many things that are said, whether it's in Western ideologies or understanding of the pineal gland through medicine and just keeping it at medicine, where no spiritual connection, where they just want to talk about the gland and what it secretes. But there's also obviously the Eastern understanding, long before anybody was really taking a anatomical and physiological dive onto the pineal gland. It doesn't even matter, because even I think in the 21st century, they still say that it's the most misunderstood. So even people who can actually look at and dissect it as microscopically speaking in Western medicine can't really understand how it functions. One thing that is known, though, and has been known, is that it's at its most prominent, or the most potential, is in children. And as it shrinks as we grow into adulthood, it is said in obviously different philosophies for why it shrinks, that is from just being calcified, from not letting spiritual development occur in our life, and that wonderment of childhood, or the wonderment that you have as a child, sort of closes that door. And you see that very much here in the story with Pinocchio. I mean, right off the bat in the movie itself, he's all potential. He's so intense, and so that he's operating from that third eye perspective that we can continue talking about. But I like that what you said about Del Toro is that he probably has to sort of stay in a way occulted of what his beliefs may be, only to kind of present all of this and kind of let you sort of decipher it for yourself. And here we are sort of doing that. So love where we're going with this, man. Let's just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And, even when we think about the pine cone, it's got to be connected to the pine tree. And this is going to represent the same tree of life that we fall from, that we also have to climb our way back. And it really represents the spinal cord. It represents the 33 vertebrae. And, when we're actually even looking at the alchemical process, there's actually a physical there's a physical secretion that actually happens like monthly in individuals, where they can actually like learn to harvest this energy. And it's kind of the deeper lessons of the alchemical process. But this pineal gland and its cohort with the pituitary gland is actually what we kind of talk about in the land of milk and honey. The milk is going to represent the pituitary gland, and that's serotonin. And then actually where we experience DMT is actually going to kind of come from this pineal gland. And so these two, the nurturing of the secretion that actually comes from a part of the brain called the colostrum, which actually like moves down the spinal cord to get to the sacral plexus, and then it climbs its way back up the 33 vertebrae to actually be, it actually, like, once it passes the vagus nerve, it actually sits in the hypothalamus, which is the light of the world, for 3 days. And then it actually gets processed into these two glands. And so we actually kind of learn about how, as an adult, we have to learn to harvest this energy, because it doesn't have natural secretion and fluid movement through us with as least resistance as a child, because as we go through adulthood, we meet the resistance of the world. We meet the pain, we meet the deaths, we meet the struggle. And so it affects us in our ability to actually process this naturally. This is like deeper, like, it's so interesting because it rests in the hypothalamus for 3 days, just like the sun rests during the winter solstice. And this is why, as we kind of get into deeper alchemical studies, we learn when this actually gets secreted in us, which is actually when, the moon is in the sign of our sun. And this is a special time for us to actually sit in this space and be quiet, to allow for this to actually go through its process of climbing up the 33 vertebrae. And so we're learning about that with Geppetto, which is going to be this like central figure of this character. It's really going to be reconnecting to that spiritual fluid. And it was quite literally called in ancient Greece charisma. And it was the consciousness. It's like an oily like substance that they said smelt like fish that was actually like secreted from the brain. And this is the sacred elixir. This is the Christo. This is the Christ consciousness that needs to be saved in the system. And it's actually a process that happens within us. But as we go through the process of calcination, not only do we not produce the secretion, but we don't know actually how to harvest it. It gets pushed out by the lower levels of energy, rather than letting those energy centers, which are like the chakras or the sethera, actually like rotate this energy and bring it back up to the pineal gland, which will be the representation of the third eye. And so it's a fascinating process that we see Geppetto struggle through, because again, this is our struggle. We lost that childlike innocence. We're going to lose the inner child. Now, this is an important process in maturation to lose that inner child, but it's reconnecting to the child in a practical, healthy way. And everything that kind of comes in between, even the rambunctiousness of when we get introduced to that child as an adult and it's not incorporated yet and it's all running around, which we'll obviously kind of get to. But, you know, this idea of the pine cone, the fruit of this tree being so dominant as the seed, and that's all we see. But to immediately come with him actually mourning by the grave, because the first experience we have with Geppetto, he's actually by the grave of his son that we're going to meet that's lost. And I think this shows quite literally the fall into matter and the dance of you have life, and then you immediately realize that you're going to die. And this is actually represented in the zodiac. The first house is the coming online of reality. Oh my gosh, I'm alive. I'm a separate entity from my mother and my father. You know, I have my own sovereign experience. And in that excitement, whether you're super happy, whether you think you're late for baby work like a Capricorn, or you're like trying to show off like a Leo, there's a situation where you fall down and you bump your head. And you feel pain for the first time, and you feel resistance of form. And we kind of perceive that as death. And that's exactly what we kind of see in this story. It immediately jumps into the celebration of life of this Christ consciousness, and then the heaviness that zaps this and actually calcifies this in this 5 sense reality that we kind of have this trade-off to experience. And that's why the story is kind of about a tradesman, because it talks about the trade that we went through, that we kind of brokered to leave the infinite collective to journey in the sovereign personal experience of consciousness, with the idea of we learn this trade so we can make that trade back into connecting to that universal consciousness in our own sovereign way. And so, you know, I think it's so interesting how we have this explosion of life, and then we're immediately met with the one thing that we're guaranteed in life, and that's death. You know, it's not that we're going to have personal love. We might not be guaranteed fame and riches, but the one thing we know we can be guaranteed is death. And we see this early experience of this such important archetypal pattern to understand playing out as soon as like the curtains open up.
Awesome, man. A lot to unfold on what you said, and like going back to, and I don't think we need to go back too far in regards to the pineal gland, but there's so much to, you know, talk about with regards to that Christo, that essence, that elixir you talk about. And I think that the way that the movie incorporates the idea of what this initiation will have is done with death. And I think that's the best way to reach people in a primordial sense, is that, you know, to really wound you in the beginning as he's wounded himself, you know. And I think that's why, you know, so many people who explore even the significance of this movie explore the ideas of, you know, what it means to come online. You know, you mentioned dimethyltryptamine, which is DMT. And, you know, obviously most people are familiar with that, as it's hallucinogenic compound that, you know, is found in ayahuasca. And so a lot of people who are curious now on how to sort of go through an initiation are subjecting themselves to different ways of getting to that place where we once might have been as children and what we might have lost. But once again, a film can do that to you as well. So, it's nice to have the compound, it's nice to have the experience, but to do it by a visual is very powerful because it's hard to do. It's very easy for us to see a visual, to take a movie and start immediately judging it from the very get-go of like, well, why this and why not this? And I actually, the first time I saw this movie, to make a point, I was with five, and four of the five were like, I don't know if I really want to watch this right now. It got very real too fast. They all kind of were like, can we do something else right now? Mm-hmm. And I was so disappointed because I was like, wait a minute, no, come on, like give it a chance. And they were like, no, which is very telling of even just the process of going through. If you ever have had your experience with ayahuasca, my experience with it, there were many individuals going on their own personal journey, and there were many people who were rejecting it, even though they subjected themselves to that ceremonial process. When it started, you could sense who was there and just let go and who was there and denied. And so you kind of see that with Geppetto. So there's sort of a pull, but there's a push with the character right away. He's hurt and betrayed, and in the opening scene, there is this moment where you can see that he's been closed off, and he's been betrayed because he looks up at the sky in such disarray and tears and anger for the loss of his child. And this is after he's long gone too in the opening scene. And he's, of course, something that's very relatable to even now. He's wounded, but he's drowning his sorrows with alcohol. And there's this moment where you kind of see like this guy has not necessarily just turned gray, turned old, but also his heart has blocked out much of the understanding of what it means to mourn and what it means to sort of go through this process that, I'm not saying he's denying, but he's not also, coming to peace that he lost his son. There's anger in him. And so, again, there's a lot that they incorporate, and you're absolutely right in that opening scene. And we can go on again. There's so much. Like I even had, certain things I was going to bring up regarding René Descartes, which is a 17th century French philosopher who, tried really pushing the idea of the pineal gland and what it really represented, and how he was sort of ridiculed and sort of, told that there's no correlation to what he's presenting with regards to the pituitary gland or the pineal gland and its significance. And so there's been push on this forever, and I think there still is. And I think, again, this movie sort of does that for you. It gives you that initiation process if you're willing to take it. And I think that's just, again, huge. So, but I want to go back to what you just said about waking. You said something about like falling.
Yeah. And, man, yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to touch really quick with you on the use of film to actually kind of tap into that DMT experience, and to, because I think that's such a good way to understand how these archetypes and mythologies touch you in a different kind of initiation kind of way, and just why that could also be kind of denied, because ultimately, this is something that is produced inside of us. Even when we sit in ceremony for ayahuasca, it's trying to wake up something and communicate to something that's already inside of you. So this is naturally occurring, and we can actually find ways of plant medicine, but we can also use ways of form and symbols and even film and art to actually create that secretion and create that process, and to educate the individual on how they actually can like tap into that at all times, because it's always there for us and it's always kind of present. And I think that that's, such a unique thing to kind of think about as what does wake up in that moment of the denial of even like going on the journey of watching this film.
You just said something that I think is wonderful about the awakening, is that when people say these generic terms, of like, oh, once your third eye is open, or once you're awakened, and they're becoming very quickly, watered down for those who don't want to really investigate what the definition of that might be. But what you just said is exactly the point, is that once you have reached that point of opening up that, say, secretion again that you might have had of this wonderment as a child, you see the world obviously in a much more different and vibrant way. And so many people who have gone through ayahuasca or through other ceremonial processes or other, hallucinogenics, man, I'm struggling with that word today, but then they kind of let themselves be open to so much. And so obviously with music, I know that there's people out there who will deny certain music and certain artists because it's touching feelings that they haven't even dealt with in a very long time. And I've literally had conversations with people who go, I don't like that song because it makes me feel this way. And obviously I'm not going to sit there and say, well, that's silly, you should get over that. It's like, that's your own process to go through. And so once again, with film, in regards to this movie, if you haven't had that opportunity to awaken that side of yourself, or maybe dealt with something heavy, it will get heavy super fast in the beginning and make you not want to see it, like I just described with those individuals who are sort of like, I'm not ready for this, nor do I want to be ready for this. And what am I going to do? I'm not going to be like, well, we're going to watch this. It's like I couldn't do anything about it. And so
Right.
You're absolutely right, man. That the way that film portrays this initiation and other things, like I said, once you're open to it, like a child is, all of it can hit you like a wave of emotion, and you can see it for what it is. And it could be glorious, or you can eventually, grow old and deny so much of it that when it does try to penetrate or tries to enter, it's more likely that you'll be defensive and more, upset about why it's even tickling this part of you. You're just like, why am I even here right now? And so obviously you see that in a ton of films when it comes to this initiation. So, but yeah, what I wanted to do, and you can stop me here and I'll edit this out, is that I want to talk about how you just said how you fall from above, into matter, into understanding your form. And there's a scene where Geppetto, as he's just so angry and chopping the tree, there's so much that happens in the moment of the night that he's just feeling betrayed. Do you want to start off from there? Because
Yeah, man. And I think we should, because, we kind of have the opening scene where he's at the grave,
Yeah.
but we just have the mourning. We don't really have the anger at this point, because we kind of have to do the flashback
Oh, right.
of his experience with the boy, where we actually meet his son. And I think that there's something really special as certain kind of indicators that are represented in that presentation of almost this flashback.
Yes.
Because we kind of come to see him at the grave, where he's mourning. And we actually can kind of see, actually, as this story develops and it pans out, we actually see the destructive habits that are created from this pain and this loss. It's not just sadness. We're going to see it come out as anger and self-inflicted pain through like alcoholism and the blindness that kind of comes from, attaching ourselves to such a hypnotic chemical for such a long time. And so we have this like introduction where we see him mourning, and then we go through this loving experience. And death, although it's brought up, it's quickly forgotten. And it shows the idea of fear and how quickly that can actually like leave the child's mind, to where that we meet death, but then there's so much happening in the world around us. And that's actually what kind of represents with the third house. As in the second house, we like meet our finiteness. We understand that there's an expiration date to this experience, but there's just so much wonderment, and there's so much to learn about this and so much to explore. And the third house opens up our curiosity. It opens up our ability to communicate with other sentient beings and have this process of interaction with other souls. And we see this represented really in a beautiful way between this father and their son. And this is going to represent the into connection of the creator with the creation, the Saturn with the sun, the idea of the father with the child, and it shows this unison communication that's growing through them. But right away, we see trials of an initiation beginning. Um, there's in the opening scene that we see them together, there is not only do we see a foreshadow of what's coming in the collective with like the airplanes that go overhead, but one of the first two main things that the canvas focuses on is they both bite an apple or a pear. And this is to mark that the initiation is beginning. The tree of knowledge, we have bitten the apple. We have now taken the aspect of like approaching the idea of sin and the idea of free will, and the consequences and the heaviness that comes by biting that apple of desire. And that's the desire for a conscious life and a conscious experience. We're going to see the young boy as well as Geppetto bite this apple. And these apples are going to play a big role because, again, we kind of spoke about it. These are representations of little Apple iPods. They're little, bitten through sin. That's the gateway into life. And so these apples are going to mark this initiation of something beginning. And right away, we start to see later astrological signs being represented. There's a painting of his shoes, and there's the giving of the shoes. Well, the shoes are going to represent Pisces. So that means that we're going through a portal at this point. We're going from one life to the next. And this is very much the end of a story. This is the demise. Everything goes into Pisces to turn to dust. And we see this with the wooden shoes and the celebration of the shoes, because Pisces is going to represent the feet. And so we see this completion of this idea that although his connection is strong with his child, there's like these lessons and this process of Saturn is coming back around. Like you've completed to the octave you were supposed to complete it, but now we're about to take the next step. And we could even see this with not only the feet, but there's also a blacksmith or an individual who's making a horseshoe. And he's speaking about Geppetto's character and the greatness of his son. And he's got this hot metal, horseshoe that represents Sagittarius. And he actually drops it into the water, which is going to be the cooling down aspect. And that's going to represent Capricorn. So we can kind of see this idea that there's going to be some sort of sacrifice and there's going to be some ending as we know it, but the ending is going to kind of lead us to another beginning. And we see this kind of with the connection of all of these energies as like, here we have this like what we see as a perfect family and even a perfect society, but we don't understand the turbulent conditions that are about to be presented with them in the future. And it's not only Geppetto who's going to lose his son, but the whole town is going to lose its innocence with the coming of this conflict, this armed conflict, which I think in this one is represented by, World War I.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love every reference you're talking about in regards to the astrological timeline that is presented. I did not see it for that. When I kind of see the pattern of where it's going. Obviously, they kind of have this impending doom that's probably going to be coming, especially when you see the wonderment in Geppetto's eyes when he's playing with his son and spending his days with his son in the sun. Just sort of living a sort of careless life. And there's a beautiful song that he sings to his son also that I really like, that his widowed wife had written. And there's so many little things that you can pick up. But that's awesome, man. Because obviously there's this moment where he comes around the corner into the village there in what would be probably Tuscany or somewhere in Italy. And the iron worker says that's the role model of an Italian, of a true Italian. And everyone's just like, oh, they're so perfect. And there's just such like admiration for their connection that they have, that it allows you to sort of feel as if though you were one of the villagers also admiring the connection that a father and son have on their journey together. And you kind of, are invited to share that sentiment because, you know, obviously nothing is placed there for no reason. You know, they didn't just come up with that in a script, or didn't have a voice actor just come in and say those few words for no reason, you know? So that's awesome, man. I had no idea. But yeah, so I think shortly after is when you sort of see the opening to them going into the church,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And I think, yeah, and you know, as we're kind of looking at these archetypal stories, we're, and I love that you brought up the idea of the widowed mother, because the sacred feminine plays such a huge role in this story, but we actually don't see it represented in any kind of human form. It's going to be represented through Mother Nature and divine universal guidance as that feminine mother consciousness creation energy. But we don't see it in the physical form. It's actually absent, but it's kind of interesting. A lot of times when that widowed energy is absent, that's actually who we're searching for. But this story, it's the mother was never not there. Mother Nature is always going to be there, and that guiding force of creation in that motherly way is always kind of there. This is really the story of like saving the father. And we see this role of the father archetype also in the comment that that Italian man made. Because, yeah, we might have gotten now to the level that we're the ultimate supreme like understanding of what it means to be like a citizen of a country. Well, now it's time to like evolve to like a true worker in the universe, and we graduate above these like limit, not so much limiting, but they're just we take the step to the next octave. You know, we go from the father figure as that male component of consciousness to society. It's like the next level, where the mother's next level is Mother Earth, you know, and then we take society and we go to the ultimate level. And that's that universal life force energy that is, you know, the lowest common denominator of all energy. It's like that OG original generator. And so we're kind of in our own father's eyes. We've gotten the respect and the support of others, but that's not really where we're going to find everlasting happiness, is by other people being like, oh, you're a good man. Well, that doesn't matter. We think there's a lot of good men in this world who are probably terrible men, and there's probably terrible men that were actually better men. Like it's not for the society to judge. That's not your judge. Let them judge, but like they're not the ones to say who you are as like the level of your character. And so it's kind of this idea of even approaching this idea of like connecting to our universal character above like these personas, because although he looks great, there's a persona here. There's like this idea of like going to church, but we truly don't believe, because what's going to happen is we're going to damn the same God that gave us grapes when he mashes them to make them wine, and he's going to get upset about this. And so, although on the outside, from a society viewpoint, he's got it all together, there's no foundation and there's no roots. The first part of tragedy, which is the ultimate tragedy of losing his son, he's going to lose all of his grounding. He's going to lose his foundation as being a maker, a clockmaker, the father time, and the builder. And he's also going to lose his role as being like even a responsible citizen with others, because he's going to start drinking, and he's going to kind of be, he's going to kind of have these destructive habits. And so, you know, we see it, but it's like we know disaster's coming because there's no foundation to this pyramid.
Right.
There's no understanding of actually, you know, how to use this pineal energy and this kundalini energy.
Right. No,
you know,
and
we're going to find very cool. And so, you know, like when we're learning about this process of the pineal, we awaken this energy, and we really have to learn how to utilize it and become a tradesman into it, and a carpenter or a master of this energy. And it's the same kind of idea that this electricity, the spiritual electricity that lives within us. Well, an electrician can either burn a house down or he can light a home up. And we're kind of learning through this process that we're going to be kind of come that ultimate electrical, that spiritual electrician kind of through this.
Wonderful, man. Wonderful. And again, there's so much you say that, you know, I want to always dial back a few steps before we move forward. I want to go back just a bit. But one thing that personally I take from Geppetto and his journey that needs to be considered for every individual on this path is something that we've said so many times on this podcast as just people who've experienced this. And it's actually something that I know many people fear, but I think a lot of people assume that going through a process, and we'll use the alchemical process to raise yourself to the next octave, has its, its doom and its gloom and then its rise, but it doesn't mean it's not bound to happen again. And so one of the main things that I take away from Geppetto is that he's already evolved one time before. He's a man who has nothing to prove. He's widowed, so he went through a tragedy. He doesn't have any more children except for just Carlo. And so there is nothing else for him to fall back on. So I can assume from my perspective or my way of visually seeing this movie that his time of pain has already happened. It's like, this is why he's so joyful in a way that he's like, I have already lost my wife, but look at my son. It's my son. It's a new chance to continue life. Life can be hard. Life can be, very dark, but here I have my son. He's got so much into that. He's got so much faith into his relationship with the life that he has now, because he is an older gentleman as well. So I think one of the things, back to the iron worker, even the iron worker himself is an archetype of a man who isn't really necessarily in the same, I wouldn't say the same boat, but in the same realm that Geppetto finds himself in, because the man is just like, that is an Italian. I mean, even his voice is just like kind of rigid as he's being rigid with metal, and this man, Geppetto, is not afraid to sing. He's not afraid to sing and take in basically the role of the mother for Carlo, that is his son. There is no bitterness in him that you see a very rigid father who's like, yeah, I'm widowed and, it's time for bed, call it a night. He's just like, oh, you need me to play you a song. You need me to put you to sleep. Like, he took on that role. And so one of the things that I find very harsh in this life is that you may find yourself in that position as well, where you're like, I already went through a very painful process. I've evolved. This is my new evolution. This is who I am. But that, we talk about this all the time. That's not that, I mean, you're lucky if that's where it ends for you and you sail off into the sunset. But that's not what's going to happen to him. And I think that's where rage tends to double down, is that you think you've already been betrayed. You raise from the betrayal of what life might do to you. Therefore, you're now good. Like, almost like there's a God wink there where it's saying, hey, you went through it. You evolved from it. Now you have this great life. You have a job that isn't necessarily a job, but it's a lifestyle, which in his case, you can see the way he builds and constructs for the town. He's not sitting there like the iron worker going like, I'm just doing this monotonous thing. And you also have this joy from your son and the new life that's coming from him. And it's all good when it's really about to get, again, double down onto worse. And so that's something that was setting me up, me as an individual, Eduardo, watching this movie. I'm like, oh my gosh, again, it would be so much more comforting for someone like me to watch this and go, oh, but he's got 2 more kids and he's got a wife, and oh, he lost Carlo. So, okay, well, that's really sad. People lost children back then a lot easier, but he's got more to fall back on. He does not. And so that's very heavy as far as this process that he's going to have to go through maybe his second initiation, for all we know. We don't know what it was like when he lost his wife, but you can guess that he got over that and moved forward. And now he's going to have to be taken down a peg again, in a sense. So that's something that I kind of like take away from the conversation that you just brought up prior to me wanting to interject that thought. So anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and it's kind of interesting because we see it as bringing down a peg, but he's actually moving up a peg. He's actually moving up an octave, but we don't perceive that. And this is what's difficult about judging. This is the experience of Father Time, and the pitfalls of analyzing a moment in the moment we find ourselves in, because we actually don't know what this door opens up to, and the experiences that it's going to lead to. And this is what Geppetto represents here, is Father Time, and the idea that everything you create is going to die. There's no way around that. And so what we're going to see here is, yeah, he mastered physical creation. He mastered, the emotional support of the family, even though, and he's even was, like you said, was able to sustain maybe the losing of his wife. This is his only child. We're not saying that's easy, but what this is he's reached a limit now to where, everything you make is going to turn to dust. What are you going to create that's eternal? And this is the process. This is the mark of initiation. So I like that you brought up the point that this is not somebody coming in on base zero. They've been through experiences. They've been battle tested. I mean, just look at him. You could tell he's been battle tested with like the gray beard. Even his skill, his trade. Like he is a master. But now we're being asked to be a master of a bigger craft. We're approaching Pisces. Everything's going to turn to dissolve. Like everything you create is going to turn to dust. And this is part of this understanding of Father Time that Geppetto kind of represents. And our, the trade that we took to make this trade is that we have to live in linear time. Although it's all one big moment, we perceive it as individual moments as we go through it in this like linear collapse. And so we have to struggle through him when he kind of goes through these new openings and these new gateways. And it really is the ultimate disaster we could kind of think of. But from this and the result of this and the result of losing something that is finite, we can actually connect and make something that's infinite. And that's what Pinocchio is going to kind of represent, and the eternal life that he kind of carries on afterwards. And so it's asking you, what have you created? What kind of foundation have you created? How deep do your roots go? It reminds us that this climb that we're making, the roots of the tree have to go down into hell and experience hell for the limbs to blossom into heaven. But the tree touches both ends because we have to experience both. And we really kind of find in this climbing up of the sacral tree, which is our nervous system or our spinal cord, we climb the same tree that we fell from. This is why, again, with the biting of the apple, like it's this new process and this new journey. But you're right. It's not a young hero going on this journey as Geppetto
what I was
is.
going to say is he's playing the archetype you talked about with the grandfather, I had a very strong connection with my grandfather, and you see that immediately kind of resonate with an individual who may have had that relationship, which is like he gives his son many, many permissions. There's like no moments where the kid is being scolded as much as he's being shown, as much as he's being, given an opportunity for growth. And so again, there's a lot of these little things that you notice that this man is an evolved man from, again, maybe from tragedy, maybe from just years. And so I love that you're bringing up the idea of him being Father Time, because he really is. But yeah, man, solid.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So all I was going to say, and you can go back if you want, if I'm going forward too fast, is they as a craftsman, you see all the little knickknacks he makes and the tchotchkes for the town, but more importantly, he is working on his biggest project along with his son, which in this case is a wooden Christ. And I think that's obviously they're going to incorporate that for the time being in that century of Pisces, and having the idea of Christ being the representative, especially in an Italian town, with Catholicism being the overarching spiritual guiding force that this town probably relies on. And they're working on this giant wooden cross, and you kind of see the admiration the son has for his father Geppetto, as he's putting this together for the church. He's the one and only putting it into existence right there. And you're going to see a lot of this scene of Christ throughout the movie, which I think, again, you brought this up in the beginning. There's a lot of Eastern and Western mysticism and objects that are presented throughout this film that kind of give you the idea of, more or less how to connect, whether you connect one way through Catholicism in this case, or through the idea of Christ consciousness, or you connect through Eastern philosophy. You were mentioning this earlier. Del Toro does a good job at sort of kind of keeping both fully present. So do you want to go into that part right there where he's in the church?
Yeah, I think that's such a good tale, and I think it very much equates to the idea of, loving the image of Christ, but not truly like walking in its image and walking with Christ and following the
Right.
footsteps. And I think that this is what the Pisces feet with the shoes kind of represent, is we're going to start that path to actually walk as the world's savior, which Pinocchio is going to ultimately be when he sacrifices. And so there's this whole connection of, again, kind of an attachment to the materialistic side of even the church and the structure. And there's we have the scene where we actually we see, Jesus on the cross made of wood, which is obviously going to come up such a large role when we meet the other main character of the story, which is going to be Pinocchio. So we obviously have that correspondence right away. But we have this idea of the Christ not completed. And we have this Christ that it almost looks like it's sleeping. It's because he's still kind of doing the crucifixion and working on it. The Christ consciousness is dormant on the cross. And this is representing, again, the dormant Christ consciousness potential that's asleep within the main characters. They haven't awoken to this higher understanding that's of this like Christ expression that kind of comes through us. Again, we've kind of met society's standards, and maybe even like what a man's standards is, or like the standard of like what a wise old man would be. But Geppetto is more than that. He is the walking star of Christ. And so it's really, again, kind of this initiation of something beginning, and there's going to be some kind of sacrifice that's made to awaken this Christ consciousness. And I think that that's really significant, that is the color paint that he's looking for, as he kind of like grabs that from his son. And, we have the water bearer symbolism there as well, because he puts it into a bucket that he brings back up the spinal cord, and it's actually the pine cone. And we have this like realization of potential further spiritual awakenings, because the pine cone moving up that, he's got it in a bucket and he pulls it up the string. Again, this is representing like the elevation of this new potential spiritual awakening that's going to happen with a bang, very shortly after he starts to use the blood of Christ for purification. Blood is the spiritual conductor within the body. And so this is the start of the electrical charge. This is the red that's going to kind of start the explosion, to kind of conduct the energy that we experience with like the tragedy that's going to kind of happen in the church. That's just about to follow this. And I think it shows a lot because, there's this understanding as well as, the damaging that's actually going to happen to this like holy place as well. And we're going to actually see the decay through the priest's eyes as it aligns itself with like fascism. And this is also going to represent kind of the spiritual decay of the church as it's hidden these deeper secrets. The Pope knows about what the pineal gland is, but we're not allowed. All of these spiritual books that are locked away under the Vatican. The biggest library in the world has the biggest esoteric library in the world we do not have access to, and it's under the Vatican, and it's for their eyes only. And so I think we also kind of see the spiritual decay of the church represented in this collective, and then also, all of the other things that have been attached to this like spiritual organization. So again, it's kind of like letting you know that like the grass might be greener and there might be people doing some like, spiritual things, but what is it fertilized here? And we really kind of start to see like what's below the surface. And, we really kind of start to lift the veil even deeper as we go deeper into the story with the ultimate veil of, the death of his son.
No, that's awesome, man. Absolutely. And there's also a lot of moments where if you catch it and you watch it again, that they're insisting on the pine cone being pure. The boy keeps looking for the right pine cone. He's searching for the pine cone that it's the best version of the pine cone that can be seeded so the tree can grow. And that's the only thing that he kind of keeps bringing up to Geppetto. He's like, do you think this one? What about this one? And that moment there in the church, he has the perfect pine cone in his hand. And he's very eager to kind of, show and share to his father, as his father is very busy. And it's right there and then where you start to hear this sort of clamor, or there's sort of like, ruckus in the background. And you can tell just by the way that Del Toro, does a great job at manipulating the puppets or the stop motion characters' eyes, that there's trouble in the horizon. There's something happening. And, it obviously goes without saying that there's trouble coming when you can hear bombs falling in the distance. But Geppetto still does a good job at sort of just telling his son, Carlo, hey, let's just wrap it up for the evening and go home and sit by the fire and have a nice soup. And it's right there and then where, he walks out of the church. And the boy, although very obedient, is still carrying that curiosity of a child. So even though the boy is always looking up to his father and knows when to, follow his steps, he's still very enamored by the one thing that he keeps bringing up to him, which is that pine cone, which eventually becomes his physical demise. Because as they step out of the church, you can see that there are planes coming in the distance they're not necessarily enemy planes. They're just planes, unloading their cargo. And in this case, they're bombs. And the one bomb that gets unloaded, unknown to, the pilots, is the bomb that ends up hitting the church. And they're both out of harm's way. They're not going to be killed in that moment. But the boy, in his wonderment, he runs right back into the church because he forgets the pine cone. And as he runs back into the church to get the pine cone, the bomb obviously hits the church, and Geppetto turns to sort of go after his son. And that's the last time he sees his son, but not the last time he sees the pine cone. The pine cone is immediately the only thing that comes out of the church, spits right back into the street where Geppetto has, fallen, and the pine cone's not harmed, but the sun is gone. Physical sun is gone. The pine cone remains. And it is that pine cone that he will take, and he will seed, and he will grow the tree. And I think that's a very significant moment right there. Out of all the things that can be, lost in a fire or an explosion like that, this is the one thing that remains. And so we can kind of take it from there, right? So he plants the seed, and the seed that he's talked about already, which is when one life is lost, another one must grow, as he refers to the pine cone. So Carlo dies, the pine cone survives, and the pine cone is planted, which will be the tree.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so important there that we've get foreshadowed what was the big lesson of why we ended one completion to start anew, was to understand what was eternal. And I think the pine cone surviving the explosion gives us the answer that we're going to come to at the end, which is what is eternal is the spirit. It's the connection with that universal life force that there is no beginning or end to. And so it's the dance with what goes back in the box, what goes back in the Monopoly box, and what stays. And this is a hard experience to obviously have them go through, but with one seed, with one death, we plant the seed. And it's just the idea of fertilizer. This is the process of fermentation through the alchemical process. And we really could kind of look at this as a stage of fermentation, with the idea that Geppetto has conquered the four elements. He understands how to be a good man. Like, he understands how to operate in this society and his culture in a respectable way. But now he's asking to be woken up to spiritual capacities within him that are still laid dormant, and aren't going to be able to find their expression unless there's something that can kind of, smooth them out, smooth out his stone. And that's what we kind of see with this idea, even with the original story. The original writer of the story was a Freemason, and Freemasons work with stone. And there's the idea that the stone needs to be chiseled away to be made smooth. And when it's made smooth, not only can we, run our hands through it and feel like the different components of who we are without like cutting ourselves and feel like all angles from ourselves, but we also can slide and work together with others in our community. This is why the pyramids, their greatest mystery was how the stones were cut, because they're so perfect that they don't even need adhesive to stick together. Where in our synthetic kind of understanding of ourselves, we need synthetic glue to work with our community. We need some kind of materialistic aim to partner with somebody. We don't just do it always for the spiritual accord of coming together. Oh, there's some kind of financial thing I can gain from this, or there's some kind of social gain I can gain from this. And that's why we have to stick with glue today. And we can't just slide together and work together in a communal way, because our stones aren't chiseled away. And so that's what's kind of happening. We're going through this chiseling period, but it's going to be really rough, and it's going to be, it's going to be corrosive. It's going to take everything we have, and it's actually going to feel like the wheels of life are grinding against us. But it's through that death, and this death of what's finite, that we can actually connect to what's infinite. And I think we see this represented perfectly with what you brought up about that the pine cone survives. The pine cone survives, as well as the cross survives. Even without like the structure of the church, the cross still stays there. And, I think that's going to be a big representation, as like, no matter how inverted, modern religion can get, you can never take away the prophets and the ultimate teachers. Modern day church might be everything that Jesus didn't want to see. But they still, even though with all the kind of the bastardization of his studies and what he represented, you still can't take away the prophet. You can't take away what's eternal. And we really kind of start to see the eternal principles, foundations, and ultimately roots that Geppetto is going to need to root himself to make sure that he can withstand the other storms that are going to come our way, because that's going to be constant. The storms are always going to be coming. It just depends on how good of a sailor we actually, form and mold ourselves into. And, as we're talking about Geppetto, as we're talking about, this whole tragedy that's happening to him, I do want to kind of address something that I thought was really profound that you said earlier. And it's kind of the idea for a hero's journey, and the story of Geppetto finding his completeness. I think what makes this so difficult is, from the outsiders looking in, we see Geppetto as an upstanding individual. Like, from our perspective, he is complete. Like you said, like he survived, whether it was the loss of his wife, he's doing everything that he can. And I think that's, I think it's a really good exploration of the spiritual journey of, we don't know what we want. We know what we want, but we don't know what we need. And I think that this is a perfect telling of this, and we don't know truly our true potential. And there's so much that kind of comes, and so much that needs to be unfolded. And, I even love the idea of this character's age. We're going to have the young story with Pinocchio when he comes online and turns alive, but we still have this hero's journey of this elder individual who's still gone through so many trials and tribulations, but the universe still, desires for him to see an
inner essence that is not being incorporated into the self. And so the process of completion continues. Time goes on, and Geppetto figure, really representing Father Time, shows that these lessons in this realm are sepraternal, over and over and again. We're going to kind of keep seeing these patterns of opportunities for us to see who we truly are. And although Geppetto, I think, has done such a good job in his life to create that kind of foundation, the roots that it's desiring to reach down, which will be an experience of hell that he goes through, are the same roots that are going to ground him in to push out his branches to heaven and to experience this Christ consciousness that is trying to climb up his spinal cord and find its ultimate home and expression in this pineal pine cone gland, that every culture we've already kind of spoken about thinks is pretty much a big deal, and something we should look into and not overlook or reject from ourselves.
I agree. You make a valid point that, I know we talked about this towards the beginning when we mentioned, how the pineal gland shrinks over time and how your connection to, a higher self is what may or may not, cause that shrinkage or may cause that idea of staying away from a spiritual sense. And I think with him, maybe just having his son Carlo in his life is enough to sort of fuel that within himself, as far as the joy and wonderment, or the wonder of a child, because he can live vicariously through his child and kind of explore that. So I think he's given another chance to sort of go back for himself to regain more of a spiritual perspective that not only he's lost, but he's also turned into somewhat of betrayal, which is what you see in the opening scene when the man is so distraught. And, in that scene, kind of towards, his mourning period of losing his son, you're starting to kind of see the next chapter unfold when we are introduced to, a character that I cannot wait to talk about extensively about, but that is, Jiminy Cricket, and also, the potential of where Pinocchio comes from heartache and from sorrow and from even anger, is where, he decides to sort of take that pine cone that already grew into the tree over the course of many years while life moves on without him. The tree is kind of a constant reminder of, life has moved on without you, and you're still here, mm-hmm. feeling the sorrow and the pain of what you once lost. And so, yeah, man, I know it's a lot, and I know we've already covered so much. And so you and I spoke about how we're going to break this into possibly even a 3-part series. But I think, we'll see where we can go with part 2, because there's so much to talk about with the coming online of, this character that we're, so eager to talk about, which is Pinocchio and his journey. But, I think everything you're just saying about Geppetto is right on point, because, it is easy to kind of turn your attention to Pinocchio and sort of not forget Geppetto. But I think that in this case with Del Toro, he did a very good job of saying, like, no, there's more than just one character whose journey is unfolding here. It's not just Pinocchio. And I think in the original, we kind of, really turn our attention to Pinocchio, obviously, being the protagonist in this. But I do like how he's like, no, like, this comes from somewhere very deep. The child wasn't just born out of boredom from some carpenter who's like, I'm going to make a child. It's like, let's go and explore the pain and the loss that this man, has had or is going through in order to fuel this next life that's going to come to be part of his journey, to get a second chance at retrieving that spiritual, awakening that he might have already, turned off by the tragedy of the loss of his son, and also by the betrayal of, the joy he once had, with just his small life that he had in this village that needs to kind of be revisited again. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as we bring up Jiminy Cricket or Sebastian in this film, and that's going to be an interesting name correlation of why they chose that term. And we'll explore this as we kind of jump into the second part, because the second part is when all of the characters kind of arrive of consciousness to be represented. And, the fascinating part of what, Jiminy Cricket represents, what, Geppetto represents, what Pinocchio represents. We'll take a look at that. But the understanding as well that all parts and all components of consciousness are going to go through this evolution. And, everybody comes in with this capacity, but it's only just capacity. And it's going to be through experience and insight that they're going to be able to, really morph that or sand down, smooth out the rough edges to be able to all of the components of consciousness to work together that all of these represent, and I think that's one of the big things we always think about through these archetypal stories is we see it in variations of multiple characters. And just like we were speaking about in the beginning, but it truly is one character. It's the unification and the celebration of that true character, radiating and illuminating through. And, I think to kind of just touch with this ending of this conversation, you brought up the point to, we get sometimes blindsided in stories as like, this is the hero, these are the sidekicks. And you brought up something really great as there's in every story, there's multiple heroes. And we can even see that in our own environment when we're trying to navigate this through it. Like, yeah, we're on our own personal hero's journey, but so is everybody else. And, and it's all of these heroes working together on their own independent journeys that fuels the collective evolution. And sometimes, and I think a lot of times, that what we have to remember there is you see the other heroes, but you don't see the hero in yourself. You don't see your own hero's journey because you're like, oh, it's their hero's journey. This is the person in the spotlight. But when truly you are in the spotlight right now, working through all of these energies, balancing out all these energies, going through these trials and tribulations. So, we experience resistance. So ultimately the universe can, present to us our perfection that was always with us, but was, very denied because of traumas, pain, and everything that we kind of see through the eyes of Geppetto through this early little, quarter of the film that we've explored. And so, yeah, man, I'm really excited. I was really excited when you brought this to our attention that this should be an episode we look into. And as we kind of looked into it, we really do see that it's kind of an endless story that every moment could be broken down into much more detail. And so I think in the second episode in part 2, we're going to kind of continue to the waking up of Pinocchio and the waking up of this inner child within Geppetto and this reemergence of it. But I'm sure there's going to be things that we're going to kind of go back and cover from that first part as well, and kind of get caught up on. And, I think that this is such a rich conversation that we don't need to set any, ends on if it's going to be a 2-episode series, 3-episode series.
Right.
Maybe we be talking about Pinocchio in 2025, when we're
Well, you and I have talked about it certainly for a long time, and even the conversations we would have, since it was just you and I in private, was like, hey, this understanding of maybe a Jungian perspective, or this other understanding from some other psychoanalyst, or some other understanding of philosophy, or some other understanding of like potentiality or the hero's journey, and all of that together. We always sort of kind of pinpoint certain films that lend themselves very easily if the eyes are open to that, that what's trying to reveal to you. And I think that when I get to have these conversations with you over a movie, it's so nice because there's so many things I haven't really paid attention to, or maybe didn't correlate, or maybe if I did, I kind of need to explore it a little deeper and see what your, what angle you're looking at it from, and compare with that. And so I just really enjoy these conversations. But yeah, man, really excited to continue this and all the other things that we have to still finish on this season. But oh my guy, I can keep going on for a long time. So just want to thank all the listeners. Thanks again for listening to these episodes when we do the breakdowns of movies, and to those who even suggested it. There's been a couple people who've watched this movie and have connected with us or reached out and said, "Hey, will you guys do a breakdown of this movie?" And again, this is a conversation Dale and I have had for a long time, from the original movie, from the 40s to the latest with Del Toro. I highly recommend maybe taking a look at it again, so you kind of see where we're at and where we're coming from, if that's something you'd like to do. But again, thank you so much for all the support, and until next time then.
Until next time.